America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. As an Englishman who has an interest in American society, sometimes watching from over the pond can feel like I'm watching one of the craziest reality TV shows of all time. But I didn't know much about the origin story of this reality TV show, so explore with me as I discover all of the great nation's leaders to try and understand how they became the great world power that they are today. First up, as I'm sure you'll know, we have George Washington, who's one of the founding fathers. He would essentially help pave America's political system to what it is still today. As commander of the Continental Army, Washington led Patriot forces to victory in the American Revolutionary War. Along with the fellow founding fathers, he presidented over the Constitutional Convention in 1789, which drafted the Constitution of the United States. Thus he's known as the father of the country. So it was no surprise that 2 years later he would be put forward as the first president of the country by the Electoral College. A lot of people wanted him to be like a permanent king figure, but Washington actually turned this down, and as per the Constitution, he said it was important that the country has elections. He left office by his own accord on March the 4th, 1797, and his image is still an icon of American culture today, with many geographical locations including the nation's capital, the state of Washington, stamps and currency, all using symbolism of the first US president. Next, we have John Adams, who became president on March the 4th, 1797, and left office March the 4th, 1801. He was a fellow founding father and the previous vice president. Adams supported the British in their constant conflicts with the French, whereas most of America supported the French. He saw Britain as a better trade ally, which in the long run was probably correct. He was a poor farmer who excelled during the Revolution. He clamped down on freedom of speech against the government, which made him very unpopular and likely cost him a second term. He was also the first president to live in the White House. Interestingly as well, John Adams didn't own any slaves in his whole life, which to us obviously is the right thing to do nowadays, but back then, for any rich white man, especially a man in government, was extremely rare. The third president of the United States was Thomas Jefferson, who was sworn into office March the 4th, 1801, and left March the 4th, 1809. He actually wrote the Declaration of Independence 25 years earlier, and he founded the Democratic Republican Party. Of course, he was an inventor. Before 1905, the vice president would just be the other party's presidential candidate, and this frustrated Thomas Jefferson, so before his second term, he actually appointed his own vice president, setting a new trend. One of his biggest moves as president was he entered into a trade deal with Napoleon to purchase Louisiana, as the French would no longer need it. They were at brink all over Europe. The deal was that Jefferson would get to double the size of the United States for a dirt cheap price. When it came time to negotiate the deal, Jefferson actually thought he was only going to be buying a port in New Orleans, but it turns out the French wanted to sell all the land from the Appalachians to the Rockies and Canada. But Jefferson thought the deal was too sweet, so he went ahead and did it without consulting Congress because he simply didn't have time. He felt bad about this and knew he was abusing his powers by doing so. Jefferson went on to show neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars by banning all exports from America to France and the UK, which would go on to seriously harm the US economy. He also would ban the import of slaves from Africa, although internal slave trade would remain strong. Despite banning the import of slaves from Africa, he actually owned over 600 slaves himself, and he would father several slave children with Sally Hemings.
I think I could love you, Sally Hemings.
You're the boss.
He didn't even free his own slave children. Next, we have James Maddison, who would become president on March the 4th, 1809, and would leave office March 4th, 1817. He helped write the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He would declare war on Great Britain over trade disagreements, and most of the war would happen on the border with Canada. However, in 1814, Britain would capture Washington, D.C., forcing Maddison to flee. They burnt down the White House and the Capitol building. This was America's first war as a country, known as the War of 1812. The British continued on, but failed to capture a major strategic point in Baltimore, which would inspire the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner and tune Hail to the Chief, also written during his presidency. The war between Great Britain would ultimately be inconclusive, but it forced Maddison to push more spending into the military and form the National Bank. Many of the things America is perhaps known for today. He also owned 100 slaves while in office. The next president is James Monroe, who became president March 4th, 1817 and left office March 4th, 1825. He's the last founding father to become president. He would tour the country in a goal of forming unity between the North and the South. He'd also spread the US to the Pacific and had an idea that America could be a global empire. Jackson would invade Florida, but Spanish were quick to sell up as they realised they were no match for America. As president, he was keen to stay out of Europe's wars and wanted to focus on developing America as a country by itself. Our next president is John Quincy Adams, who took office March 4th, 1825. He was the son of John Adams and he won a tough election. He hugely lost the popular vote, but he won in the Electoral College. However, his vice president Andrew Jackson was so popular that John Quincy Adams couldn't actually get anything across in Congress. He helped develop peace in the War of 1812, and he achieved a lot across Latin America as vice president. But as president himself, his progress was slowed by Congress. He did manage to pay off a lot of national debt by creating tariffs on imported goods. This guy was a congressman for so long, he actually died at his seat in Congress. The seventh president of the United States was Andrew Jackson, a personal favourite of mine, who took office March 4th, 1829. He helped transition the Democratic Republican Party into the Democrats, and at his inauguration he invited the whole country. And it truly sounds like a party that could rival one of Diddy's freak-offs. The party lasted for days, and just to get people out of the White House, they had to put beer kegs on the lawn and start giving it out for free. During his presidency, many southern states complained about the new trade tariffs being beneficial for the North, as the South didn't have much trade industry. Jackson decided to change the tariffs to help the South. He was seen as the first president for the people. He actually dismantled the Second National Bank and was a hero for the average man against the wealthy banker. His face is also on the $20 bill today. He signed the Indian Removal Act, removing many natives from southern states to Midwest states in the infamous Trials of Tears in 1830. Andrew Jackson is famous for being an avid dueler, competing in possibly over 100 duels and actually killing one person. Charles Dickinson was killed on May 30th, 1806. It was a participation in a duel against Jackson after they had a debate about a horse. This is testament to how crazy and reckless Andrew Jackson could be. This recklessness and being a man of the people probably helped him being very popular with the everyday man. Despite his popularity, Andrew Jackson was the first president to face an assassination attempt. In 1835, January 30th, outside the Capitol building, painter Richard Lawrence attempted to shoot President Andrew Jackson with 2 pistols. Fortunately, both misfired. Jackson approached the man and beat him severely to a pulp with his cane. What a gangster. His popularity led to him serving 2 terms, and he was very popular in the eyes of the people. Next, we have Martin van Buren, who became president March 4th, 1837. He was the only president to have English as his second language, his first being Dutch. He was also blamed for the Depression of 1837. He was an absolutely useless president and really didn't do much in his time. Preceding Van Buren's one term, we have William Henry Harrison taking office March 4th, 1841. He was a war hero in the War of 1812. He was an extremely old guy, being sworn into office at 68 years old. It doesn't sound too old now, but 68 back then was like a 2024 85. He served the shortest presidency in US history. After a 2-hour-long inaugural speech in the cold and the rain, he ended up catching pneumonia. Died a month into his presidency on April 4th, 1841. The death of William Henry Harrison caused a brief constitutional crisis, since presidential succession was not fully defined in the US Constitution. Congress went ahead and probably made the most common sense decision and sworn in the Vice President John Tyler, who would complete Harrison's 4 years. The country would be in financial ruin, prompting the Whig Party to want the National Bank back, but Tyler would refuse, prompting many of his own cabinet to resign. He didn't really achieve much else as president. The 11th President of the United States was James Polk, a protege of Andrew Jackson. When he was sworn into office on March 4th, 1845, he promised that he would only do 1 term. Polk got to work right away, as he would declare war on Mexico in the early stages of his presidency. The Republic of Texas wanted to join the Union, but Mexico weren't letting go. After conquering Texas, war would wage on between the US and Mexico throughout his presidency. He went ahead and lowered the trade tariffs again to please the southern states. And towards the end of his presidency, America would defeat Mexico, resulting in the liberation of the entire southwestern region making America's outer borders look pretty much how they remain today. He added 1/3 to the US landmass, a very successful presidency, and retired after one term like he promised. He would then go ahead and die 2 months later. The next president, Zachary Taylor, was a hero from the Mexican-American War, sworn into office March 4th, 1849. First on Taylor's agenda was to deal with these new territories captured from Mexico. Was slavery to be legal in these new states? Debates and clashes in Congress would wage on throughout his whole presidency between the North and South, whether these states should indeed be slave states. The president started leaning towards the North, but South Carolina threatened they would leave the Union. Taylor couldn't come to a decision, and he avoided most of these issues while in office. He would end up consuming too many cherries and drinking too much milk, resulting in an early death with stomach issues just a year and a half into his presidency. Millard Fillmore, the then vice president, would take office March 9th, 1850, picking up right where Zachary Taylor left off. He would actually do a fairly good job easing some tension between the North and the South with the Compromise of 1850. He also opened trade deals with Japan, who had been in self-isolation for over 200 years. While running for re-election, his Whig party would collapse, and he would have to join the new Know Nothing Party, which was against the church and immigration, as the 1950s saw a spike in immigration from heavy Catholic nations such as Ireland, Italy and Poland, which really is quite ironic if you think about America's issues today. The next president was Franklin Pierce, who took office March 4th, 1853. He was a Democrat from the North, elected to reunite the North and the South over the slavery disagreements. However, he was strongly against abolishing slavery and supported the Fugitive Slave Act, which essentially meant if a slave escaped to a free state, then they would have to return him into the slave state to their enslaver. During Pierce's presidency, while they were dividing up the newfound land acquired in the Louisiana Agreement, prompted a bloody war in Kansas. People from the North and the South would move into the newly found Kansas and battle it out to decide if Kansas was to become a new slave state or a free state. This bloody war in Kansas is often seen as a prelude to the American Civil War, and eventually Kansas would become a slave state, making it the last state to join the Union before the Civil War. The next president, James Buchanan, took office March 4th, 1857. He was another loser president that would have the North and South divide to deal with, and wouldn't really deal with it. The North industrializes during his presidency, making kids work long hours in factories, and the Southern propaganda shows their slaves dancing around having a nice time while they get to work outside. Industrialization in the North sees huge amounts of immigration, meaning more votes for the next president, which would be vital in shaping the next few years of American history. On March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln takes office, seen as one of the greatest presidents in history. The South were convinced that Lincoln would free all the slaves, so they didn't even include him on the ballot. So during his inauguration, he reassured them that he wasn't actually going to come down to the South and free the slaves. But this was pretty much one of the first acts he did as president. Although he was striving for human rights, war with the South wasn't popular with many of his supporters in the North, as they argued, we have free slaves here. Why cost all the lives? Let the South do as they please and we'll have nothing to do with them. America would go on to fight a bloody civil war, taking huge losses at the start, as it didn't look too promising for the North. Side note, Jefferson Davis would be the only president of the Confederacy. Eventually, the North were victorious, and they would bring in the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all the slaves from the rebelling states, and they pushed through the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery altogether, except as a form of punishment. Lincoln was re-elected for a second term as he would see out the end of the Civil War. He was a man of the people, known for famous speeches such as his Gettysburg Address. He was assassinated in a theatre booth, ironically by a man called John Wilkes Booth. A Confederate sympathizer shot him in the head while he was sitting next to his wife, where he would then bleed to death. Vice President Andrew Johnson would take over April the 15th, 1865. He began the Reconstruction period of the Southern states, and he wanted the Southern states to rejoin the Union, but only once they had sorted out their new governments. The new governments in the South would enforce harsh laws on the newly freed people, such as no leaning, no guns, and no group worship. Republicans tried to bring in civil rights for newly freed people, but Johnson would veto until the 1866 a Republican Congress majority would push through this anyway. He also opposed the 14th Amendment to give citizenship to freed men. The Republican majority in Congress and Johnson's hostilities towards them would eventually lead to his impeachment. However, he was acquitted. During his presidency, Alaska was also purchased from the Russian Empire. The 18th President of the United States was Ulysses S. Grant, who took office March 4th, 1869. He was a war hero and a great general during the Civil War, and is another personal favourite of mine. He got to work straight away, moving to protect freedmen's rights. He dampened Confederate nationalism and the rise of the KKK. However, he was hated by his father-in-law for being an abolitionist, so out of spite, his father-in-law would gift Ulysses a single slave. Ulysses would make this guy his partner and start a business with his new partner, and eventually gift him the whole business and make him a free man. During his presidency, saw the Great Sioux War of 1876 over gold with Native Americans. He also introduced the gold standard to the dollar. During his younger military days, he was known as being a bit of a drunk, as when he was stationed in San Francisco, he was stationed at an outpost and missed his bay so much that he got blackout drunk all the time, and eventually was found passed out by a mailman. Many have said that this was his only experience with alcohol, but in the future, anytime he made any kind of mistake, the president would be accused of drinking again. And mistakes were made often by Ulysses. To be fair, he was a very trusting guy, which led him to support many corrupt organizations. He would go on to be on a train where he had met two guys who offered him $1,000 to write his biography. He told Mark Twain about this deal, and Mark Twain was absolutely furious. Twain said he would help him write and publish his own book. However, Ulysses said he had already made a deal with the two men. He gave them his word. Mark Twain would go on to eventually convince Ulysses that he should let him write his book, and it would go on to eventually become the first massively popular best-selling book in American history. He would die of throat cancer just before the book finished. However, it set up his wife for life. Her first check for the book would be $400,000. That beats the offer from the guys on the train. During the end of his presidency was the Panic of 1873, causing financial difficulty across the country, ending his presidency on quite a low note. Next is Rutherford B. Hayes, who took office in March 4th, 1877. He won a hotly contested election by winning the electoral vote but missing out in the popular vote. As a compromise, he moved the army out of the southern states, and the reintegration of these states was put on hold, leading to backward steps in civil rights. There was a heavy push on education, and he gave government jobs based on knowledge and qualifications rather than loyalty and friendship. His presidency would see the rise of capitalism. Families like Carnegie and the Rockefellers were becoming more powerful than the government. The industry in the North was absolutely crushing the South, with coal, oil and factories all making these corporations extremely rich. The next president, James Garfield, would take office March 4th, 1881. He was only president for less than a year, but he did a lot in a short period. He was a bit of a nerd. He could write Latin in one hand while simultaneously writing in Greek in the other hand. He improved US naval power, stamped out post office corruption, and improved civil rights, education, and farming technology. In the end, he was shot by a disgruntled wannabe office holder and would die 8 weeks later due to bad medical practices. Taking office September 19, 1881, was Chester Arthur. He signed in the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, meaning political jobs would be based on merit rather than political party. Other than that, there's not much to note about Chester Arthur. Next was Grover Cleveland, taking office March 4th, 1885. He was a very popular president with Congress for being a very conservative Democrat. He pushed for big businesses during his US presidency, which exploded industry. He also signed the Dawes Act of 1887, which essentially took land from the natives, divided it up, and then let them buy it back again in exchange for US citizenship. Taking over from Grover Cleveland on March 4th, 1889 was Benjamin Harrison. He was the grandson of the 9th US President, William Henry Harrison, making him the only father and grandson duo presidents. The US had a surplus of money at the time, and Harrison spends it. He also bolstered the US Navy with heavy investments, and proposed for voting rights for African Americans, but this was rejected. March 4th, 1893, Grover Cleveland would come back and return as president, being the first and only president to return in non-consecutive terms. For now. Harrison's spending would lead to the Panic of 1893, which Cleveland was unable to fix, seriously damaging the Democratic Party, leading to the Republicans having a bit of a heyday after this. Unemployment was at an all-time high at 18%. Next up to fix this mess was William McKinley, who became president March 4th, 1897. He essentially ran for president from his porch, and it was an easy W after the Democrats were so unpopular. He introduced the Dingley Act, raising rates on many things to protect the industry and the factories of the North. He also led the US wars against Spain, leading to the capture of Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Guantanamo Bay, and they gave the rest of Cuba its independence. Hawaii would also become an American state during his presidency. McKinley was assassinated after he was shot twice in the abdomen by a Polish immigrant who saw McKinley as a representative of a corrupt government. Theodore Roosevelt took office September the 14th, 1901. At 42 years old, it would make him the youngest ever president. He was probably one of the most interesting presidents, living a crazy life. He made his break in his career as New York Police Commissioner, where he reformed the New York Police Department. Cops in New York used to be old, so he put a max age limit on becoming a police officer. He also invented the police academy, so police actually had to train before they got a job. He was hardworking, but always wanted to do this work in the background, being the vice president and the number two to the president. But after the assassination of William McKinley, he was forced to step forward. As president, he strengthened the Navy yet again, and he was obsessed with the War of 1812, and he said that the US could have won much quicker if they had a stronger Navy. He noticed a failing England, opening a gap for America to become a superpower in the world. He was also the first man to invite a black man to the White House. Congress were fuming about this, so Teddy kept inviting the guy round. Tragically, Teddy lost his wife and his mum within hours of each other. They died unexpectedly, and his diary from that night paints the picture with this beautiful quote, "The light has gone out of my life." As I said earlier, Theodore was a crazy man. He suffered an injury while sparring an artillery officer while he was president, which left him partially blind in one eye. He also got malaria and almost died while exploring the Amazon rainforest. He was the first president to fly in an aeroplane, and he was a great outdoorsman. And he wanted to retain America's beauty, so he set up national monuments and national parks. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping Russia and Japan find peace. And maybe my favourite story about Theodore Roosevelt is the fact that the teddy bear is directly from Theodore Roosevelt's actions. He visited Pennsylvania, and some people in the state heard that he liked bear hunting, so they caught a bear, tied it to a tree, and handed Teddy a gun so he could shoot it. However, Teddy was disgusted by this. Teddy was a real man who wanted to hunt properly and not just shoot trophy animals. This inspired someone to produce stuffed bears and call them the teddy bear. In October 1912, Roosevelt was running a campaign for his third presidential term. As he was about to deliver a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a man named John Schrank, who opposed Roosevelt's bid for another term, shot him with a .38 caliber revolver. The bullet struck Roosevelt's chest, but luckily it was slowed down by the thick stack of papers and a metal eyeglass case that he had in his pocket. Although the bullet did in fact penetrate his chest, it missed vital organs, and Roosevelt got back on the stage and famously said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." And let's just pretend that that's exactly how Roosevelt sounded. He went on to speak for another 90 minutes while bleeding from the wound. Only afterwards he would go to hospital, where doctors decided it was safer to leave the bullet in his chest than to risk removing it. The incident became one of the most legendary moments in Roosevelt's life, cementing his reputation as a tough, determined leader with an almost superhuman level of resilience. After Roosevelt, we had William Howard Taft, who was handpicked by Roosevelt to become the Republican candidate. While in office, he oversaw the building of the West Wing and was also the first president to move into the Oval Office. He was also super fat, like the heaviest president of all time, weighing at about 340 pounds at his peak. Roosevelt would end up falling out with Taft as they disagreed on many things, and Roosevelt saw Taft as being too conservative and too interested in big businesses. This caused Teddy to leave the party, and in the next election, he would run in his own progressive party. This would split the Republican vote, leading to a Democratic landslide win for the next president, Woodrow Wilson, who took office March 4th, 1913. Wilson would have a lot to deal with as president, and dare I say it, deal with it quite well. Apart from the fact that the country was highly racially segregated at this point, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, he didn't do much about that. But he did keep the US out of World War I for a number of reasons, but eventually, of course, jump in. One of the reasons including Germany allying with the hostile Mexico in 1917. He also introduced the 19th Amendment, the woman's right to vote. He made the country a ton of money from all the loans to Europe during World War I. That perhaps catapulted America into one of the world powers that they are today, and this strategy of making money we would see come up time and time again in the future of the country, but of course more on that later. After World War I, he would spend some time in Paris, setting up the League of Nations and signing the Treaty of Versailles, for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He also had the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to deal with, which of course no one knew about until only a few years ago. It was also his vision to see democracy across the world, something America have strived for ever since, or at least use it as an excuse to drop some bombs. Towards the end of his presidency sees Prohibition, banning alcohol in 1920, though Wilson had little to do with this. March the 4th, 1921, Warren G. Harding takes office. He was the first president to speak out about lynching, where he would deliver a speech in the racially segregated Alabama, promoting equal civil rights for all and raise awareness on the persecution of the black community. However, despite this good act, Warren G. Harding was hugely corrupt, having to deal with the Teapot Dome scandal, which essentially saw members of his administration give away government oil fields to private companies in exchange for cash, bonds and cattle worth millions of dollars. While he wasn't directly involved, this tarnished his presidency, and William G. Harding would die of a heart attack only 2.5 years into his presidency. Taking over was Calvin Coolidge, who would take office August 2nd, 1923. He kept the government small and working on middle-class ideas. He was also the first president to broadcast on the radio, delivering his State of Union address to the American people. He granted citizenship to all the natives living on reservations, and during his presidency was a great time for America, seeing the Roaring Twenties, probably one of the best times America has ever seen after they were sitting on all the money from Europe after World War I. This allowed him to easily serve 2 terms, but these great times were about to come to an end. The 31st President of the United States was Herbert Hoover, who would take office in 1929. Less than a year into his presidency would see the famous Wall Street crash of 1929 known as Black Tuesday, resulting in a 25% unemployment rate and many losing all their money. Hoover would spike up taxes to try and counter the government's finance sheet falling, but this would only make things worse, making this era known as the Great Depression. The Prohibition wasn't helping either, as there was no tax dollars coming in from sales of alcohol, but the Great Depression was making many people turn to alcohol, which propped up many organised crime gangs bootlegging illegal alcohol, seeing the rise of the mafia. He does, however, have the Hoover Dam in his legacy, but protests would call for a change. 1933 would see a Democratic landslide, seeing Franklin D. Roosevelt take the reins. He severed the gold value and would just pump money into the economy to get things going again, proving that money absolutely is not real. He had polio and lost use of his legs in the 1920s, but he decided to hide his disability as president. He avoided being seen in public with a wheelchair, and when doing speeches, he would lean on lecterns or podiums, and also had specially adjusted canes that would be attached to his legs to hold him upright. His presidency saw the start of World War II, which he decided to supply the Allies with aid, including an amphetamine to supercharge Allied soldiers to counteract the messed up Nazis. If you want to hear more about this, be sure to check out my video about all the drugs used in World War II. After an attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, he would eventually join the war, putting America into total war mode, bringing unemployment down to 2%. As the war came to a close, the big 3 world leaders at the time, Stalin, Churchill and FDR, would meet in Yalta in Crimea. It was one of the most important meetings of world leaders in history, as they would negotiate key issues, including the division of post-war Germany and the structure of the future United Nations. Stalin sort of wanted to do his own thing and keep expanding the Soviet Union at the time, but to build a bomb with Stalin, FDR would mock Churchill's weight and appearance. He simply read the room and threw Churchill under the bus by making him a fat loser. FDR was elected for a record 4 terms, but unfortunately died weeks before the German surrender, right at the start of his 4th term. Harry S. Truman would take over in 1945, marking the end of the war by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. After another world war and more loans being paid by Europe, the US had now established themselves as more than just a world power. They were the world power. However, hot on their tail was Stalin and the USSR. Truman would make it his mission to stop communism, marking the start of the Cold War. One of the first things on Truman's agenda was the Marshall Plan, a bold initiative to rebuild Western Europe, pumping billions of dollars back into economies shattered by war. This wasn't just about reconstructing Europe, it was a strategic move to stop the spread of communism and lay the foundations of a stable Europe. In 1949, he would go a step further and establish the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO as you probably know it. For the first time in American history, the United States was committed to the security of its allies in Europe. Truman would also restructure the government and establish many of the three-letter organizations that still work today, such as the CIA, the NSA, and the NSC, agencies that would all become the backbone of American intelligence during the Cold War. To leave a lasting mark on America, he also supported the 22nd Amendment, limiting future presidents to only 2 terms, reinforcing the principles of the Founding Fathers. Towards the end of his presidency, he faced a major international crisis when North Korea invaded South Korea. He committed US forces to the Korean War, a controversial and costly decision, but one that demonstrated America's resolve to counter communist aggression. The Korean Peninsula obviously remains divided today. He was also the first president to be broadcast live on television from the Oval Office. Dwight Eisenhower takes office 1953, known for being a commanding general during World War II. Eisenhower would inherit the divided Korean peninsula still at war. Determined to end it, he took a bold and unprecedented step, and he threatened nuclear retaliation. The gamble, however, did pay off, and an armistice was reached in 1953. The strategy of using nuclear war as a deterrent would define this Cold War era as the Soviet Union began building their own nuclear arsenal. Eisenhower would be the first president to properly utilize the CIA and show off their dirty powers. The CIA orchestrated a covert coup in Iran, overthrowing a prime minister who threatened US oil interests. The operation established a controversial precedent showing how the US's power could reach beyond the borders in the name of American interests. In 1957, the Soviet Union would launch Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit Earth, shocking the world and sparking the space race. Eisenhower responded by founding NASA, committing the United States to the race of space supremacy. He was also further committed to American innovation as he promoted science and education to prepare Americans for the future, where he realized technology would be so prominent. While in office, he also expanded Social Security and helped build the interstate highway system, roads that stretched across the country, connecting cities and communities, fueling economic growth and ensuring military readiness across the nation. In nearby Cuba, Fidel Castro's revolution alarmed American leaders. Eisenhower quickly laid out plans to overthrow the new communist regime. This operation, later known as the Bay of Pigs, would shape the US-Cuba relations for decades. Yet, as Eisenhower left office in 1961, he issued a warning, one that still echoes in American politics today. He cautioned against the rise of the military-industrial complex, a powerful combination of defense contractors and US armed forces.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists.
The 35th president to take office, another personal favourite of mine, was John F. Kennedy, taking office January 1961. Kennedy was the first president to harness the power of television. In the first ever televised debates, his confident, polished image made a lasting impression on the American people. He understood that in this new age, the way he looked and sounded matters just as much as what he said. This was a turning point, not just for his campaign, but for American politics. Just months into his presidency, Kennedy would reluctantly sign off on the Bay of Pigs invasion, the covert mission to overthrow Fidel Castro, planned by Eisenhower in the term before. The invasion failed and was hugely embarrassing for the president, casting doubt whether his young administration had strength, yet it was also a learning lesson in some of the complexities of the Cold War. Later that year, the Cold War tensions would heighten in Europe as the Soviet Union erected the Berlin Wall, a stark symbol of division between the East and the West. Kennedy visited Berlin soon after, standing in solidarity with its citizens and promising support and resilience, even as the wall made the Cold War's grip more visible than ever. In October 1962, the world would hold its breath as US surveillance discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, Kennedy and his advisors worked tirelessly to avert nuclear war. Through intense diplomacy and a naval blockade, they reached a resolution and the missiles were withdrawn. The Cuban Missile Crisis would be one of his greatest tests, but also one of his greatest triumphs. Despite the Cold War's grip on the Earth, Kennedy's eyes were set on the stars. In 1962, he challenged the nation to land a man on the moon by the decade's end. In his words, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." Kennedy's vision inspired a generation and ignited a race that would define the space age. That was pretty good, if you ask me. While all these great feats were captivating the public, he had rumours and secrets of his personal life. A swindled affair with Hollywood star Marilyn Monroe. However, let's be real, he's not the first or the last US president that loved. As racially charged protests spread across the South, Kennedy found himself at a moral crossroads. While initially being cautious, he eventually took decisive action in civil rights, proposing new legislation and supporting Martin Luther King Jr. Kennedy's stance marked a turning point in the government's support for racial equality, although he would not live to see it realised. On November 22, 1963, the unthinkable happened. In Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy was shot and killed. The world mourned as a nation grieved the loss of the young leader who had given so much hope. I'm not going to get into the assassination here, as we could be talking about it all day, but let's just say Kennedy's death left America with questions that still remain unanswered today. Leave a comment if you'd be interested in a video from me breaking down the assassination of John F. Kennedy. As a nation grieved, on November the 22nd, 1963, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson would become the new leader of the United States. Johnson was no caretaker. He had his very own visions for America, a nation free from poverty and racial injustice. His ambitious plans would come to define his presidency. Johnson launched the War on Poverty, one of the most sweeping social reform agendas in American history. From educational programs to health initiatives, he believed that the federal government had a duty to lift Americans out of poverty and create equal opportunity for all. Johnson's new visions of a great society aimed not only to address poverty, but to end racial discrimination. In 1964, he signed the Civil Rights Act, banning racial segregation in public areas, and a year later, he championed the Voting Rights Act to make voting accessible and fair for all Americans. But Johnson's commitment to civil rights came at a political cost. Long-term Democratic strongholds in the South saw these changes as a betrayal, and many Southern voters turned to the Republican Party, which adopted a more conservative stance on states' rights and individual liberties. The political landscape was shifting, creating a divide in American politics that I still think we see today, especially in the most recent election. While Johnson would sought for peace and prosperity at home, the same can't be said for his international policy. He sent thousands of troops to Vietnam in what they saw as a crucial battle against communism. But the war dragged on and its unpopularity grew back home. Americans questioned the cost in the lives and the resources, and Johnson found himself entangled in a war that seemed to have no end. After the assassination of MLK in April 1968, racial tensions flared and American cities erupted into riots. 2 months later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, an advocate for peace and justice, was also assassinated, leaving many of the nation's citizens in tatters. Johnson's great society that he promised seemed more elusive than ever. Critics argue that Johnson hadn't done enough to address racial and societal divisions, and the ongoing war in Vietnam only fueled this discontent. By 1968, Lyndon Johnson was exhausted. He announced that he would not seek re-election, choosing instead to step away from office he had held through both triumph and turmoil. In 1969, Richard Nixon would take office, entering the White House with a promise to restore stability to a divided nation. Just months into his presidency, when Nixon witnessed one of humanity's greatest achievements, the Apollo 11 moon landings. On July 20th, 1969, America watched as Neil Armstrong took humanity's first steps on the moon. From the White House, Nixon made a historic phone call, speaking to astronauts 240,000 miles away.
This certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House.
It was a perfectly timed moment, bringing a much-needed boost of morale to the nation. I think one area we can all agree Nixon failed was the war on drugs, framing it as a battle to protect American society.
This is drugs. This is your brain on drugs.
His policies ramped up drug enforcement and sentencing, resulting in a significant increase in incarceration rates, particularly for black Americans.
Drug addiction in the United States is under control.
Away from home, Nixon promised to end involvement in the Vietnam War. However, he did invade Laos and Cambodia before actually pulling troops from Vietnam. He also opened his trading doors to communist China. Despite America's anti-communist stance, he recognized the importance of engaging with the world's most populated nation. But his diplomacy didn't end there. He also sought to ease tensions with the Soviet Union in what was known as the Detente, a signing of an anti-ballistic missile treaty. Nixon and Soviet leader Brezhnev took steps to reduce the nuclear threat, beginning a cautious thaw in the Cold War. 1973 saw the oil crisis, when Arab nations imposed an embargo in America's response to support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Gas prices soared, and America saw fuel rationing for the first time. Nixon also established the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, responding to growing public concerns over pollution. Yet Nixon's legacy would forever be marked by one of the greatest scandals in American politics. In 1972, 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee offices at the Watergate complex. An investigation would unfold, and it became clear that this break-in was connected to the Nixon re-election campaign. Despite his efforts to cover up the scandal, the truth would emerge. Facing mountains of evidence, Nixon's grip on power began to slip. The release of secret White House tapes revealed the president was deeply entangled in the scandal. Amid threats of impeachment and an overwhelming public distrust, Nixon made a stunning decision to resign. In 1974, Vice President Gerald Ford would take the oath of office, pledging to move the nation forward to restore honesty and decency in government. Congress responded to Nixon's disgraced resignation by curbing some presidential powers. One of my favourite things that was an outcome because of this was the Freedom of Information Act, which still happens today, which allows US citizens to request information from the government. I mean, it kind of works, but if I ask the government for the full JFK file or the full 9/11 file, I guarantee I won't get it. With these new checks and balances in place, Ford inherited a presidency with fewer powers than any of his predecessors, yet he had the difficult task of restoring faith in the US government. However, despite all these checks and balances, Ford still made the controversial decision to pardon President Nixon. I mean, you can imagine how controversial this was at the time, but Ford argued that the country needed to move on without the distractions of a drawn-out legal battle. Despite these challenges at home, Ford aimed to make his mark on the world stage, when in 1975 he signed the Helsinki Accords, an agreement that improved relations between the East and the West, setting out a bunch of human rights standards that communist states must agree to uphold. While the Helsinki Accords didn't immediately end the Cold War, they did establish some connection between the East and the West. In 1975, unemployment would rise and inflation surged as America entered a recession. Ford introduced a campaign called the Whip Inflation Now, or WIN, encouraging citizens to cut back on spending, conserve energy and save. Despite his efforts, many saw the initiative as inadequate. It's also interesting to note that Ford was technically the only person to take office without receiving a single vote from any American person, as he only became vice president when Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign amid corruption scandals, funnily enough, and then the same became president because Nixon was forced to resign. Part 3 starts with Jimmy Carter taking office in 1977. One of Carter's defining achievements came in 1978, where he acted as a mediator between Egypt and Israel to end decades worth of hostility between the two nations. Back home, however, Carter faced a different crisis. In 1979, a reactor at 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania suffered a partial meltdown. As fears of radiation exposure spread, the nation would hold its breath. Carter would visit the site to calm public fears, but the incident raised lasting questions about nuclear safety in America. In the same year, 79, Carter faced an international crisis.
Iranian students continue to hold more than 50 hostages at the American embassy in Tehran this morning.
The new Iranian regime demanded return of their deposed leader, Sahar of Iran, who was granted asylum to the United States. But the US would refuse these demands, and despite negotiations and sanctions against Iran, the standoff would drag on for 444 days. While each day passed, Carter's presidency became more defined by this crisis, straining his image as a leader and leaving the American public anxious and frustrated. If you've not seen the film Argo, I highly recommend it. It's about this incident and it's a fantastic film. This Iranian revolution and the trade embargoes caused a severe energy crisis in the US, sending gas prices skyrocketing, causing long lines at fuel stations. Carter would address the nation, urging energy conservation and even wearing a sweater to demonstrate his point. 79 would prove to be a busy year for Carter as tensions were simmering with Iran. Another threat would emerge. On December 79, the Soviet Union would invade Afghanistan, ending a period of detente between the two superpowers. Alarmed, Carter shifted US foreign policy, halting grain exports to the USSR and strengthening support for Afghanistan resistant fighters. Carter would also take the drastic step of boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics, urging allies to join in. The decision certainly sent a strong message, however, it just disappointed many athletes who had trained for many years only to lose their chance to perform on the world stage. With the Iranian hostage crisis unsolved, Carter faced an additional complexity when Iraq decided to invade Iran in 1980. Though tensions were still high, the ongoing war ultimately led Iran to agree to release the hostages, who returned home just as Carter's presidency came to an end. Although Carter's presidency was marked with crises, his commitment to peace did not end when he left the office. In 1982, he founded the Carter Center, an organisation dedicated to promoting democracy, conflict resolution and disease eradication all around the world. In 2002, Jimmy Carter was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, and his dedication to peace and human rights transcended his time in the Oval Office. He's also the oldest president still alive today at this time of recording in November 2024, at 100 years old. The 40th President of the United States was Ronald Reagan, who took office in January 1981. He was a former Hollywood actor, which would prove for the first time that the presidency is really just a popularity contest. Reagan entered office with bold ideas about economics, which would soon become known as Reaganomics. His administration cut taxes and reduced regulations on big businesses and hoped that the wealth would eventually trickle down to the everyday American. But of course it doesn't work like this. While corporate profits surged, the benefits failed to reach the everyday American. Instead of trickling down, the wealth stayed concentrated at the top and created a bigger divide in wealth between the ultra-wealthy and the poor. Just months into his presidency, he faced a near-fatal assassination attempt by a young man, John Hinckley Jr., who claimed that he was doing it for actress Jodie Foster. He left the president with a punctured lung and just inches from death. John Hinckley Jr. was actually released from prison fairly recently, and he's currently trying to make a career as a folk musician. I hope that goes well for him. Reagan's approach to the Cold War wasn't great, to be honest. He would undo a lot of the good work done by Jimmy Carter. He declared the Soviet Union as an evil empire and launched a strategic defense initiative, an ambitious and unproven plan to build space lasers that would shoot down Soviet missiles. It was dubbed Star Wars, and it fueled the arms race back up, highlighting tensions with the USSR yet again. To counter the Soviet expansion, Reagan's CIA would arm Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. This support, intended to fight communism, was a calculated risk, and years later, some of those fighters and weapons and skills turned against the US. One of those Mujahideen fighters supported by the CIA will be propping up again later. It was during this era that the CIA were really up to some shifty stuff, as the Mujahideen weren't the only people they were arming. The Reagan administration was secretly selling weapons to Iran, who were actually America's enemy at the time. They did this in exchange for helping freeing some hostages in Lebanon. It also turned out the profits from these weapon sales were being used to fuel Nicaraguan Contras fighting against the Sandinista government, despite Congress's ban on funding them at the time. The fallout was significant, and the investigation revealed a complex web of covert actions, some serious black ops stuff. His presidency would also see the AIDS crisis, which he was criticised for dealing with, as he was slow to respond, with over 70,000 Americans dying before his administration took any meaningful steps to address the crisis. In 1987, Reagan would stand at the foot of the Berlin Wall, calling on Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the barrier dividing the East and the West. Though the wall didn't fall immediately, his challenge became a powerful symbol of hope in a world still divided by Cold War tensions. As Reagan's second term wore on, concerns about his health surfaced. Many reports suggest that he was repeating stories and struggling with memory loss. Just months after Reagan left the White House, the Berlin Wall came down, a symbolic end to the Cold War. The 41st President of the United States was George Herbert Walker Bush. From a young age, George H.W. Bush was groomed for leadership. Born into privilege, he followed in the footsteps of his influential family. At Yale, he would join the elite and secretive Skull and Bones Society, a club, if you like, that was also counted other future leaders among its ranks, like his father Prescott and his son George W. After serving in the military, George H.W. Bush took his career further into the public service, eventually becoming the director of the CIA in 1976. His experience in intelligence gave him a unique perspective on global threats and secured his status as a key player on the world stage. While on the campaign trail, Bush would make a promise that would come to define his presidency.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
It was a pledge that resonated deeply with voters. However, this promise was broken. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein's Iraq would invade Kuwait, threatening the stability in the Middle East and yet again the world's oil supply. President Bush would take decisive action, rallying a coalition of nations and leading Operation Desert Storm to push Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. The Gulf War was swift and effective, lasting only 43 days with minimal casualties. It showcased American military power and the commitment to protecting its interests abroad. It also put Bush's approval rating through the roof. However, the choice to end the war without removing Saddam Hussein from power would be a problem he would hand on to his son some years later. Despite his success in Operation Desert Storm, Bush's presidency was undermined by a struggling economy as a recession gripped the nation in 1991. Unemployment would rise and public discontentment grew. Taking over in 1993 was Bill Clinton. Born William Jefferson Blythe III, his early life was actually marked by hardship, despite his name. It might be hard to believe. Although his stepfather was abusive, Bill would eventually take his stepfather's last name as a gesture of respect. In his early career, he grew hope in small-town Arkansas, where he developed a political charm that would later define his career. As the governor of Arkansas, he promoted a progressive vision for its people, but alongside this ambitious political agenda, there was whispers of corruption. At the heart of this corruption lies a small town called Eine and a man named Barry Seal, who was a skilled pilot turned drug smuggler. It's alleged that Barry Seal was smuggling drugs and working as an informant for the CIA and the DEA. It's alleged that this cocaine smuggled into Arkansas was being used to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, which were also funded by the illegal sale of weapons to Iran during the Reagan administration. It can be suspected that Bill Clinton was in the CIA's pocket at this point, perhaps making him the perfect president in the eyes of the CIA one day. I guess it's important to note that Clinton and the CIA deny involvement or knowledge of Seal's operations. However, Barry Seal was assassinated in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, allegedly by hitmen from the Medellin cartel, but to me, this story makes no sense. It's definitely an interesting topic and I'll be making a video about it one day, so subscribe if you'd like to see that. During his presidency, he presided over the longest period of peace and economic growth in American history. Under his leadership, unemployment would fall and wages would rise. The country enjoyed a booming economy and his administration marked an era of optimism and expansion. He was known for his charm and easygoing nature, which quickly developed a reputation for Clinton being a ladies' man. In '98, this reputation would erupt into a scandal that would define his presidency. Clinton was accused of having an affair with 22-year-old White House intern Monica Lewinsky. Under oath in a completely separate harassment case, he denied having the relationship with Lewinsky, where he said these famous words.
"I did not have sexual relations with that woman."
Once the truth came out, Clinton became the second president in US history to face an impeachment. Though he was acquitted by the Senate, the scandal left a lasting stain on his legacy. On the world stage, he would manage to broker a peace deal between Israel and Palestine, although it didn't really last, did it? However, at home, his policies leaned pro-business. His administration's repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act removed restrictions on banks, allowing for corporate mergers and the expansion of big finance. Many would later blame these decisions contributing to the 2008 financial crisis. Post-presidency, Clinton's name has been tied to a dark web of conspiracy theories, but one thing that certainly isn't a conspiracy theory is that he flew on a certain jet to a certain island 26 times. Taking over from Mr. Clinton in 2001 was George W. Bush, making him the second president to be son of a previous president. Just months into his presidency, Bush faced a tragedy that would shape America and his legacy forever. On September 11, 2001, we all know what happened. Al-Qaeda, a terror organization run by Osama bin Laden, the guy that was previously propped up by the CIA, struck the hearts of all Americans. With 4 hijacked planes and thousands dead, the nation was gripped by fear and grief. Bush would respond quickly by declaring a war on terror. This led to the invasion of Afghanistan, aimed at dismantling Al-Qaeda and overthrowing the Taliban, who had harbored terrorists, but the war on terror would soon expand its scope. In 2003, the Bush administration turned its sights on Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein. The administration warned that Hussein was stockpiling weapons of mass destruction, posing a direct threat to the US and its allies. Bush authorized the invasion, preemptively disarm Iraq, but the conflict dragged on, and guess what? No weapons of mass destruction were found. The Iraq War was very controversial and ignited protests worldwide. Critics accused Bush of destabilizing the entire Middle East. The power vacuum created by Saddam Hussein created an environment that allowed extremist groups to thrive, a chaos in the Middle East that still persists today. In response to these terror threats, Bush signed the Patriot Act, which granted unprecedented powers of law enforcement and the National Security Agency. The Patriot Act sparks a huge debate on security versus privacy, a debate that still lives on today. Somehow, with all the criticisms growing against Bush, he managed to win a second term in 2004. Perhaps down to his folksy style and unique way of words.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
It made him a bit of a cultural icon, but behind the humour of the man himself, the challenges of his presidency were severe. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans, and the government's response was slow, and citizens were left trapped in flooded neighbourhoods. Then in 2008, a financial disaster struck. Unregulated lending had created a housing bubble that finally burst, leading to a global recession. The Bush administration also seemed scrutiny in the way it handled its prisoners of war. Allegations of torture at Guantanamo Bay, as well as other detention sites, raised questions on America's commitment to human rights. Bush would defend these practices as necessary to protect the nation, but the ethical implications left lasting scars in America's reputation. In 2009, Bush left office, handing over a country deeply divided and facing extreme economical crisis. Inheriting these issues was Barack Obama, the first African-American president. Obama and his team were the first to effectively harness the power of the internet, revolutionizing how campaigns are run. On the internet, Obama could engage with millions of voters, ushering a new digital era to politics. Obama was inheriting the worst economy since the Great Depression. Determined to stabilize the financial system, he introduced regulations aimed at keeping financial institutions in check, providing relief to millions of Americans. Obama's known for his Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which aimed to reform the healthcare system, extending affordable health coverage to millions of uninsured Americans. He also legalized same-sex marriage in 2015, becoming the first sitting president to openly support marriage equality.
Today, the department is submitting to Congress our plan for finally closing the facility at Guantanamo once and for all.
However, the Republican-led House blocked his plans, leaving the detention center open throughout his presidency and still today. Perhaps Obama's most celebrated achievement with many in the West was his successful mission to locate and kill Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks, but Obama's foreign policy was far from simple. The Obama administration's wide use of drone strikes against terrorist cells in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen and Somalia were seen as effective by the government as they eliminated many high-profile targets, but they were also controversial due to the huge number of civilian casualties caused by these drone strikes. To put it into context, in the 8 years of the Obama presidency, he conducted more than 500 drone strikes, killing almost 1,000 civilians, but of course this is just a prediction, it could be way more. On a slightly more positive note on foreign policy, Obama was the first president to visit Cuba in 88 years, marking a shift of the new era in US and Cuban relations. He also made climate change a priority, signing the historic Paris Agreement in 2015. After 2 terms, Obama left office as a figure of hope, resilience and change, a symbol of the complexity and promise of modern-day America. Donald J. Trump, rich and powerful businessman, TV personality, and polarizing figure, would make a surprise run for the Republican candidate. The American people were clearly ready for change, and Trump would definitely provide change. In office, he quickly acted on his America First promise, as he pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, citing costs to the American jobs. But Trump's controversy, of course, wouldn't end there. His administration implemented a controversial travel ban targeting several Muslim countries, and he banned transgender people from the military. Many of these policies would culturally divide the country, but social divisions would just grow deeper under Trump's presidency, as in 2017, violence would erupt in Charlottesville, Virginia, as white nationalist groups clashed with counter-protesters. Trump's response, saying that there were very fine people on both sides, became one of the most controversial moments of his presidency. Racial tensions would escalate even further after the death of George Floyd and the subsequent BLM protests that followed. These events all defined the Trump era all around the world. One of Trump's major campaign promises was the famous wall between the US and Mexico border. The wall, together with strict other immigration policies, stirred national debate over immigration reform and humanitarian concerns. While all this controversy was going on at home, away from home, Trump was making friends. He made history by meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, a move that sought to ease nuclear tensions. He also became quite pally with Vladimir Putin and always states that under his presidency there were no wars. He also ordered the mission that resulted in the death of ISIS leader
Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is dead. He died like a dog.
Whatever you think of Donald Trump, one thing that's hard to deny is that he's kind of hilarious, with all the different quotes throughout different debates and his prolific use of Twitter. The fact that we were seeing a president share the thoughts on his mind live in the moment was groundbreaking and maybe something we actually never see again from a US president. Trump's last year in office was marked by the COVID-19 pandemic, where his critics would accuse him of downplaying the virus. However, he did accelerate the vaccine development through Operation Warp Speed, but it's ultimately the pandemic which probably cost Trump his second term. Second term this time round anyway. The 2020 re-election campaign were marked with claims of widespread voter fraud. These allegations fueled distrust among many of Trump's supporters. On January the 6th, a rally in Washington would turn violent as Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, leading to deaths, arrests, and Trump's second impeachment, this time for an incitement of insurrection. Trump was the first president to be impeached twice, although both times the Senate did not convict him. In his final days as president, he would conduct a series of controversial pardons to his political allies, different celebrities, and former campaign staff. The most crazy one to me being Kodak Black. However, we didn't see those pardons that we really wanted. People like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, for example. In 2021, Joe Biden would take office as the 46th president of the United States. Taking office at a time of unprecedented crises as the nation was socially divided and there was a raging pandemic. Biden would be the oldest president to ever take office, with many of his supporters citing a wise mind and years of experience. However, we all know how that turned out. Biden's political career spanned nearly 5 decades, from a senator representing Delaware to 8 years as the vice president under Barack Obama. Biden's personal life was marked with tragedy, including the loss of his first wife and daughter in a car crash, and later the death of his son, Beau, to cancer. Biden's first act of president was tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, where he launched the massive vaccination campaign, expanding testing and implementing of the mask mandates on federal property. They also introduced the American Rescue Plan, providing direct payments to Americans and small businesses, a $1.9 trillion package aimed to jumpstart the economy that had been battered by the pandemic. He would also go against what Trump had done and re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement, with a pledge to cut greenhouse emissions in half by 2030. One of Biden's most controversial moments was to withdraw US troops from Afghanistan, ending America's longest ever war. The rapid Taliban takeover sparked widespread criticism over the handling of the evacuation, though Biden stood firm on his decision to end 2 decades of conflict. His administration's foreign relationships were also tested when Russia invaded Ukraine. The US would rally along with NATO allies to provide military and humanitarian aid, and of course more recently sparking tensions even higher when the American missiles were used to fire into Russia. A lot of Biden's time as president was reversing a lot of the Trump-era policies, such as having transgender people in the military and the immigration restrictions. However, the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade would galvanize social debates and divide the country even further than it already was. Joe Biden also might have the most legendary son of all the presidents, with his son Hunter being in the news multiple times throughout his presidency for the famed laptop story. I won't get into it too much now, perhaps we can save it for a future video. As Biden's presidency went on, his cognitive ability was questioned, with many stumbles in his speech and literal stumbles and tumbles captured on camera. It was hard to see this man as a leader of the world's greatest nation. He would eventually step out of the race for his second term, where Kamala Harris would take his place, leading to Donald Trump unanimously winning a second term in what was touted to be a close race. As Trump would become the second president to be elected twice in non-consecutive terms, his inauguration in January 2025 will set up a presidency in which the nation's people are clearly ready to see huge change.